We're on. So thanks everyone for coming. My name's Chris Sulham. I am a solutions architect at Velir, based out of Boston. I've been working with Sitecore since 2008, and I am here to talk today about how we at Velir are grappling with the many heads of Headless. So to begin, I want to go back in time a few years to the Sitecore 9 days. We knew JSS was out there. We knew headless sites were a thing. But for our most important projects, for our biggest clients, we stuck to what we knew, and that was ASP.NET MVC. We'd been building Sitecore sites with MVC for many, many years, and we were really good at it. But, you know, the specter of headless was looming on the horizon all this time. We knew it was coming, and we knew at some point we would need to face it. So then, you know, and now we have a process. We have a process for building MVC sites, one that we've refined over the years. And each member of our team, they had their role, and they had the tools they used in that role. The designer would mock up our designs for the feature in Figma. The specs came from the analyst who wrote our tickets in Jira. Our front-end developer then took those designs and built the markup in Storybook. And then that gets handed off to our back-end developer who wired it up in Sitecore. And finally, the component gets sent to QA who ran their test cases out of TestRail. So we repeat this for each component many times in a project, over many projects, over many clients. We have retros, we have postmortems, we track metrics and base new project estimates off of those metrics. Each time, we hopefully refined the process, improved it, and to make it more efficient, more productive. All this experience made our developers specialists in their roles. Our front-end devs are experts at things like accessibility and responsive design. Our back-end developers, they know the minutiae of Sitecore, and they can solve the most obscure problems or prevent them from even happening in the first place. So let's fast forward a few years. Sitecore's made their big pivot. XP, it's being replaced with these new composable offerings. As we've been hearing for the past 2 days, XM Cloud, it's here. Headless is the new hotness, and if we want to stay current, we have to get on board. So what does that mean for our development process, that thing we've been refining and streamlining for a decade now, or more? So when you first look into the headless offerings, you've got a lot of choices. 5 to be specific, but really there's only 2. You've got .NET Core, and you've got JSS. And fundamentally, the architecture is the same, but the execution is different. So for us, we're faced with a tough question. Do we go the .NET Core route, or do we go the JSS route? And more importantly, what is the cost of that switch going to be? So to answer that question, we decided to do some pilot projects to compare the approaches. But first, we had to figure out how we're going to measure the cost of switching. So we determined there were a few things we wanted to track. First, it was the time to train our team members on this new technology. What do they need to learn, and how long do they need to learn it? Second, what technical assumptions do we need to reconsider? What development patterns, integrations, things we take for granted every day, like what do we need to rethink in this new headless architecture? So next, we've got our time to delivery. Is it faster to work in these new stacks? Maybe it's slower. Maybe it's roughly the same. When do we start making that judgment, accounting for the learning curve and training time? We also have to consider our accelerators and libraries. Almost every Sitecore shop, we have something we use to kickstart a solution. What can we still use? What do we have to rebuild, and what do we have to throw away? And finally, we need to consider what the final delivery is going to look like. How will we architect our environments? How do we instrument the solution? Where do I look for logs? How do I debug issues? How do I handle problems in production? These are all things that we need to think about. So before we can do all that, we do need to pick which headless approaches we're going to try. So .NET Core is the obvious one. It's .NET. We have a bunch of .NET developers on staff already. And it's probably pretty much the same thing, right? Just throw the rendering host on the CD server, and we're good to go. And then, we've got JSS. We all know JSS. It's been around for a few years. There were even stickers at a few symposiums ago. And, most of us ignored it back then because, ew, JavaScript. I'm saying that as a .NET developer. Nobody get offended. So JSS, it's got 4 options. We've got Angular, we've got Vue, we've got React, and we've got Next.js. So which one should we pick? And so Angular and Vue, we didn't really consider those for very long. Like I mentioned, we have a front-end team, and they did analysis of those frameworks, and they generally favored React. And I think that's pretty much industry-wide. React is winning that race. So we actually did do a small blog project on JSS a few years ago using React, and our front-end team uses React every single day, so that just seems like a natural choice. Is it a natural choice this time around? And because we've got Next.js, which is the new kid on the block. And Next.js is interesting. It was created by Vercel, who has very generously sponsored this event. One of Sitecore's brand new partners. And Vercel has some pretty big names on their client list. If you stop by their booth, you might see them. It makes them hard to ignore. So developing with Next.js, we do use React, but we code in TypeScript. And TypeScript is one of those, it's a controversial language. The front-end developers, they don't really like it because they're forced to use types. The back-end developers, they don't really like it because, once again, ew, JavaScript. Which means no one's very happy, so it's probably a pretty good compromise, as a wise man once said. But to be honest, what really sold us on the Next.js approach was the symposium where it debuted. Our development team, they dug in right away, and we really did feel like it was the most solid choice for a JSS framework going forward. And you may have also noticed, if you've been working with Headless, that Sitecore offers 2 Headless starters. You've got one for .NET Core and one for Next.js. So it does seem like they're kind of trying to tell us something. So I'll start with .NET Core. As I said before, we have a decade of experience building .NET MVC. Across our Sitecore development staff, we probably have over 100 years cumulative experience with .NET. So we have several Microsoft certified developers on staff. That is all very valuable experience that we have built up over the years, and our developers, they suffered for it in the trenches. So we're not just going to throw that away, are we? So let's take a look at the factors I mentioned before that we're going to measure. So the training, we'll start there. Believe it or not, .NET Core is actually not the same as .NET Framework, ASP.NET MVC. There are some things you're going to have to learn if you're a Sitecore developer. The good news is our front-end team doesn't have to worry about it. They can keep happily working on their Macs and handing off deliveries in Storybook without ever worrying about what's going on with the Sitecore folks and what they're struggling with. The next thing is our patterns. So we're building a headless site now, which means almost every assumption we make about a development pattern or an integration needs to at least be reconsidered. For example, what do we do about search and custom indexes? You may have got some answers to those questions in some of the previous sessions already. You don't use Solr anymore. How do we log in? What happens with gated content? How do I do personalize? I just came from that session. That's some good questions there. So some of those answers will be obvious, some will be harder. Some of them you may think you know the answers right now, and then you're going to dig in and find out, oh no, actually there's some things I didn't know. So the next thing we're talking about is our velocity. Once we're over that learning curve, the development velocity of .NET Core should be roughly the same as our old .NET MVC projects. Because really the only change here is what our back-end devs are doing. And they're wiring up their Sitecore renderings in a different way. Finally, we've got our delivery. And there are some questions that we need to answer here. For example, where do we put our rendering host? Do we put it on a CD server? Do we even need that CD server anymore? Can we use Experience Edge? What complications does Experience Edge bring with it? These are all things we need to answer. One big advantage we do get to the .NET Core approach is that it is still .NET, right? We have all of Microsoft's, the behemoth of Microsoft behind it. We've got all those instrumentation options at our disposal. And, we've got MSDN, we've got, we've got MSDN. That's a pretty big deal. And we can even tack some more features into that .NET rendering host if we want to. So for example, in our pilot project, this client, they had quite a few MVC routes that they were using for apps on their current site, the one that we're going to rebuild in .NET Headless Sitecore. So those routes and the controllers and logic to handle those routes, we've actually been able to add them to the rendering host and have them work seamlessly side by side. Some requests go to Sitecore, some requests go to those custom app routes that they have. And this saved us a ton of time not having to rebuild those features. So now next let's talk about Next.js using those same metrics. Training. This is totally new to us, right? There are excellent tutorials and exercises from both Sitecore and Vercel out there. But TypeScript is not C#, and TypeScript, it is not pure JavaScript either. It is similar enough to both, though, that we're not going in completely helpless. But there's going to be a significant learning curve. Our patterns. It's still a headless site, so all those same considerations I just talked about for .NET, they apply here. But we have a few more. Do we use Vercel? As I don't think you have to. Do we go with static site generation and take the Jamstack approach? With the requirements for our project, can we do that? Our velocity. So like I said, there's a big learning curve here. And all of our old libraries and accelerators, they're not helpful anymore. And there are some challenges there. But where we have challenges, we can also find opportunities. So I mentioned before we had a process with front end handing off to back end. Does that still make sense in a Next.js build? Can we just have one developer take a component end to end and build it? Is it just a matter of our front end developers learning a few things in Sitecore, like how to wire up a template and some renderings to a presentation layer? So we did do some trials of this and started blurring those lines on our development team. And it turns out it's working out. Our front-end devs and our back-end devs, they still have their experience in their areas of expertise, like that muscle memory and just sort of stuff they've been building up over all these years. But they're also picking up new skills. And they feel like they're growing as professionals all the while, which is, I can't say enough about that. And it turns out that the team is actually embracing this challenge, and they're actually really enjoying working on this stack. So happy developers are developers who stay on. They don't quit. We don't have to hire to replace them. So that's pretty valuable. So finally, we've got our delivery. And this is where Next.js has really shined for us, and it was with Vercel and Experience Edge. So working with Sitecore and Vercel, we got a turnkey solution to hosting. And we did wind up taking the Jamstack approach and using static site generation. And the results so far, if are familiar with static site generation, they've been amazing. This page is just, they're instant. So Vercel, it's really the killer app for Next.js. And they're not paying me to say this. This is my honest opinion. It's a CDN Lite. We can deploy to it easily. It offers support for middleware, for edge functions, for serverless functions. It even has intelligence for your statically generated site with features to support caching at the component level. So after hearing these things, it may seem to you like the choice is obvious. I'm not going to make a recommendation in this talk. For one, we haven't actually finished and launched either of these projects yet, so it's premature to say how these measurements are going to turn out in the end. But also the choice is really going to depend on what's right for you, for your client, for your organization, and for your project. But there's a couple more things that I'm considering, and maybe you might consider too when you're thinking about what's right for you in the future. And the first is that JavaScript, it's the language of the web. I don't think anybody can deny that. So what's it like hiring new developers to work on Sitecore projects right now? What's it going to be like 5 years from now? What is the future of .NET? I'm not saying .NET is going to go away, but if you've looked into Microsoft certifications lately, I don't see one for .NET. So it seems like there's maybe a de-emphasis of that on Microsoft's roadmap. And finally, what is the role of the back-end developer in a JSS project? Do we start training our front-end team on Sitecore? Do we start teaching the back-end developers how to write CSS? Thank you all for coming. This was a short talk, and I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions, but I'm Chris Sulham here for Boston. Hit me up on Sitecore Slack. I don't really use Twitter anymore because all that drama, but yeah, feel free to hit me if you have questions. If anyone has questions right now, happy to take them. Oh, and all of the images in that deck were generated by AI, almost all of them. So.
Thanks a lot. Unfortunately, no time for questions.